They say you should never whistle in the woods at night in Appalachia. Say it invites things you don't want to meet, things that can wear a familiar face, or worse, use a familiar voice. They have many names, whispered from the Blue Ridge to the Smokies, but the fear they inspire is always the same. It's a primal dread, a feeling that you're being watched by something that sees you not as a person, but as a disguise it could wear. So listen close. I've got 3 stories for you tonight, tales pulled from the deepest, darkest corners of the mountains. These stories have never been shared on this channel before. So if you've been waiting for a new descent into fear, thank you for joining us. Your support is what makes these narratives possible. Every listen, every comment, every shared moment of unease keeps the lantern lit. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let's journey into the unsettling heart of the Appalachians. Remember, listener, discretion is advised.
Park Ranger Alston had worked the rugged trails of the Pisgah National Forest for 20 years. He was a man made of the same tough, weathered material as the mountains themselves. He'd seen folks get lost, seen bears up close, and once helped rescue a group of hikers during a flash flood that turned a gentle creek into a roaring monster. He thought he knew the forest's every mood and secret. He was wrong. It began in late October, when the mountains were ablaze with the fire of autumn leaves. A call came in about a lone hiker, a college kid named Ben, who was 3 days overdue. His car was found at the trailhead for a notoriously difficult 15-mile loop. Alston wasn't overly worried. Kids often bit off more than they could chew and hunkered down for an extra day. Still, protocol was protocol. He packed his gear and headed out at dawn. The first day of the search was uneventful. Alston and 2 volunteers combed the main trail, their calls of "Ben! Ben Galloway!" swallowed by the immense, indifferent woods. By the second day, a thick, cold fog had rolled in, blanketing the mountains in a disorienting gray silence. The volunteers stayed back, but Alston, trusting his internal compass, pushed deeper into the backcountry. That's when he heard it for the first time, a faint cry. "Help me!" The voice was thin, strained, and seemed to come from a ravine to his left. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch! I think I have voice contact. Moving off trail to investigate." He moved cautiously, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The forest was eerily still, the fog so dense that the ancient trees looked like gray specters. "Keep calling out, son!" Alston yelled. "I'm here! I'm hurt!" The voice was closer now. Alston pushed through a thicket of rhododendron, his eyes scanning the steep, rocky decline. He saw nothing. "Where are you, Ben? Talk to me!" There was a pause, then the voice came again, this time from behind him. "Over here!" It sounded deeper. Alston spun around, his hand instinctively going to the hunting knife on his belt. The fog swirled, but the trail behind him was empty. A chill, entirely separate from the autumn air, crawled up his spine. The woods had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, not even the hum of insects. It was a dead quiet he'd never experienced before. He tried his radio again. Static. He chalked it up to the terrain and the thick weather. He decided to press on toward a landmark, a waterfall marked on his map. As he walked, he felt a profound sense of being watched, the kind of feeling that makes the hair on your arms stand up. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sounded deliberate. He reached the waterfall near dusk. The roar of the water was a comfort in the oppressive silence. As he scanned the area, he saw something on a large, flat rock near the water's edge. It was Ben's backpack, one strap corn, but next to it, pressed into the mud, were tracks that made Alston's blood run cold. They were shaped like a human footprint, but were impossibly long and thin, and at the end of each toe was a deep, sharp indentation, as if from a claw. The strangest part was the gait. The prints were far apart, suggesting incredible leaps, and they led from the woods to the pack and then straight into the roaring water of the falls. Night fell fast in the deep woods. Alston made a small, smokeless camp, his back against a rock face, his senses on high alert. The fog didn't lift. Around midnight, the voice started again. "Help!" It whimpered, sounding like a child just at the edge of his camp. Alston didn't move, his heart hammering against his ribs. The voice began to circle his camp, moving with an unnatural speed. "So cold! Ranger, please help!" Then it changed. It became a perfect mimicry of his wife's voice. "Al? Honey! What are you doing out here? Come home!" Alston squeezed his eyes shut. He knew his wife was 50 miles away, safe in their bed. This was a trick, a vile, terrifying trick. The voice laughed, a dry, rasping sound that wasn't human at all. Suddenly, a large rock clattered down the cliff face beside him. Alston scrambled back, shining his headlamp up towards the sound. 2 points of light, a sickly yellow-green, stared back at him from the fog, about 10 feet up. They weren't the eyes of a bear or a cougar. They were too far apart, and they blinked, slowly. As he stared, a long, pale limb, thin as a branch and ending in dirty claw-like fingers, reached out from the mist and scraped against the rock. Alston didn't wait to see more. He abandoned his camp and ran. He fled blindly through the dark, foggy woods, falling, cutting himself on branches, but never stopping. Behind him, he could hear it keeping pace, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4. Its mocking voice a horrible medley of the lost hiker, his wife, and the inhuman laughter. He ran until his lungs burned, and the sun finally broke through the fog, and he stumbled back onto a main trail, right into the path of a fresh search party. They never found Ben Galloway. When Alston told his story, his superiors marked it down as stress-induced paranoia from a difficult search. They gave him a month's leave. But Alston knew what he heard. He retired a year later, never setting foot in the deep woods again. He knew that something ancient and malevolent lived in the heart of the forest, and it was hungry for voices to steal.
The hollow where the Miller family lived was a place the modern world had mostly forgotten. Tucked away in the coal country of eastern Kentucky, their small clapboard house stood in the shadow of Black Mountain. Jacob Miller was the last of his line to work the mines, and now, his lungs thick with coal dust, he was slowly fading away in a hospital bed set up in the living room. His daughter, 20-year-old Clara, was his sole caretaker. It started with her father's ramblings. In his moments of pained lucidity, between fits of coughing, he'd stare at the window and whisper about a visitor. "It comes at night, Clara," he'd rasped, his voice thin as a whisper. "Where's your Uncle Ray's face?" Clara's Uncle Ray had died in a mine collapse a decade ago. She'd brush her father's hair back from his sweaty brow. "It's just the medicine, Daddy. You're dreaming." But her father was insistent. "No, it just watches, stands by the old oak. It wants in, says it can make the sickness go away." A shudder would run through his frail body. She dismissed it as grief and sickness weaving cruel tricks in his mind. Then she started to notice things. It began with the dog, a loyal old hound named Rusty. One evening, Rusty began to whine, a low, pathetic sound, while staring intently at the front door. He wouldn't bark, he just whined, his tail tucked so far between his legs it touched his belly. He refused to go outside after dark, scratching frantically at the floorboards if Clara tried to make him. A few nights later, Clara was washing dishes, the only light coming from the bulb above the sink. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement by the old oak tree at the edge of the yard. She squinted, wiping her hands on her apron. It was a tall, unnaturally thin figure standing half hidden by the trunk. It was too dark to see a face, but it was utterly motionless. She felt a jolt of fear, thinking it was a prowler, and quickly turned off the light. She peeked through the curtains. It was gone. The visits became more frequent. She'd catch glimpses of the gaunt figure at the edge of the woods, always watching the house.
Her father's condition worsened, and his night terrors grew more vivid. It knocked, he'd whisper to her in the morning, his eyes wide with fear. Tapped on the glass, said it had a gift for me. It sounded just like your mama. Her mother had passed from fever 5 years prior. Clara tried to rationalize it. It was a hunter. It was a trick of the light. But she couldn't explain the feeling of dread that now permeated the old house, a coldness that had nothing to do with the coming winter. One night, the phone rang. It was well after midnight. She picked it up. "Hello? Clarabelle, let me talk to your daddy." The voice was her Uncle Ray's, a perfect replica of the warm, gravelly tone she remembered from childhood. Her blood froze. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. There was a pause, and then a low chuckle that seemed to scrape its way through the phone line. "He's sick, Clarabelle. I can help. Just open the door." She slammed the phone down, her heart pounding. She looked at her father. He was fast asleep, his breathing shallow. The final night came with a storm. Rain lashed against the house, and wind howled through the hollow like a grieving spirit. The power went out, plunging them into absolute darkness, save for a few battery-powered lanterns. Her father was agitated, thrashing in his bed. "It's coming, Clara! It's tired of waiting!" Then a soft tapping started on the living room window. Tap, tap, tap. Clara froze, holding a lantern high. Rusty was whimpering under the kitchen table. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It moved from the window to the front door, then to the back door, then back to the window, circling the house with impossible speed. Then a voice cut through the storm, right outside the window. It was her own voice. "Daddy, I'm locked out. Please let me in. I'm scared." It was a perfect imitation. Clara stared in horror at her own reflection in the dark glass, knowing she was inside, safe. Her father began to cry out, "Clara, go let your sister in!" Clara didn't have a sister. The thing outside laughed, a horrible, distorted version of her own laugh. Then it began to beat on the door, the wood groaning under the force. "Let me in!" it shrieked, its voice now a layered chorus of her uncle, her mother, and herself. Clara grabbed her father's old shotgun from the mantel, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She didn't know what to do. The pumping stopped. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the storm and her father's panicked gasps. She waited for what felt like an eternity. Then, from the roof, came a slow, deliberate scratching sound. It was inside. She never told anyone the full story of what happened in that house until the storm passed. When the neighbors came to check on them the next morning, they found the house in disarray. The front door was splintered, and deep, claw-like gouges ran down the walls. Clara was sitting in a corner, clutching the shotgun, her eyes vacant. Her father had passed away in his bed. The coroner said it was his lungs that gave out. But Clara knew. She said the thing that got in didn't take him. It just stood over him, its face a shifting nightmare of her dead relatives, and seemed to breathe him in, leaving nothing but an empty shell behind. She sold the property for pennies on the dollar and moved west, far away from the shadows of Black Mountain.
Frank was a trucker, a man who measured his life in miles and deadlines. For 15 years, he'd hauled goods across the country, and he prided himself on never being late. So when a rock slide closed I-40 in North Carolina, he didn't hesitate to take the detour his GPS suggested, a winding, lonely stretch of state highway that cut deep through the Nantahala National Forest. It was called the Midnight Route by other truckers, and most avoided it. The road was narrow and twisted back on itself like a wounded snake. The forest pressed in on both sides, so thick and dark it seemed to swallow the beams of his headlights. Frank was on his third cup of coffee, fighting to keep his eyes open, when a deer bolted into the road. He slammed on the air brakes, the truck hissing and groaning as it jackknifed slightly.
coming to a stop just inches from the animal. The deer stood frozen in his headlights, its eyes wide with terror. Frank let out a shaky breath, his heart pounding. Then, the deer did something impossible. It lifted its head, and its neck seemed to stretch, elongating upwards. Its front legs buckled and bent backwards at the knee, and with a sickening series of cracks, it slowly, unsteadily, stood up on its hind legs. It was no longer a deer. It was a tall, hideously malformed creature silhouetted against the dark woods. Before Frank could even process what he was seeing, it turned and scrambled into the trees with a loping, unnatural gait. Frank sat there for a full 5 minutes, trying to convince himself he'd fallen asleep for a second, that it was a waking nightmare. There was no other explanation. He finally got the truck straightened out and drove on, his eyes scanning the woods, his bravado gone, replaced by a cold, creeping fear. 10 miles later, he saw a light up ahead. It was a single lantern, held by a figure standing by the side of the road. It looked like an old woman in a long dress waving him down. Frank's company had a strict no-hitchhiker policy, but something about the desolate scene made him slow down. As he got closer, his headlights illuminated her. Her face was pale and slack, her features oddly smooth and undefined like a worn stone, and her arm that was waving was far too long, bending at an angle that wasn't right. He saw the same wide, terrified eyes he'd seen on the deer. He stomped on the accelerator, roaring past as the figure's head snapped around to follow him, its mouth opening impossibly wide in a silent scream. Now he was terrified. He was being hunted. He pushed the truck as fast as he dared on the winding road, the engine whining in protest. In his rearview mirror, he saw movement. A shadowy form was keeping pace with him, flitting between the trees at the edge of the road. It was impossibly fast. He rounded a sharp bend and saw it again. This time, it was standing in the middle of the road, directly in his path. It had taken the form of a state trooper, one hand held up to signal stop. But the uniform was tattered, and the face beneath the hat was a distorted, melting caricature. One side was a waxy, human-like mask, while the other was the raw, furred face of a deer. Frank swerved violently, the truck's tires screaming as he clipped the guardrail. He didn't look back. The engine sputtered. The temperature gauge was flashing red. The guardrail must have damaged the radiator. With a final dying cough, the engine cut out, and Frank's truck rolled to a stop, plunging him into a terrifying silence. He was stranded. He fumbled for his phone. No signal. He sat in the dark, his breath fogging up the cold glass of the windshield. He locked the doors. Then, the tapping started. A light, inquisitive tap on the passenger side window. He didn't look. The tapping moved to the windshield, then the roof. Then he heard a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a perfect recording of the dispatcher's voice from his CB radio. "Everything all right there, driver? You've gone quiet." A trick. Frank squeezed his eyes shut. "No," he whispered. The voice giggled, the sound distorted and layered. Then it switched to the sound of his brakes hissing, then the cries of the deer, then the silent scream of the old woman. It was replaying his terror for him. Something heavy slammed against the driver's side door, denting the metal and cracking the window. Frank yelled, scrambling over into the passenger seat. He looked through the spiderwebbed crack in the glass. A face was pressed against it. It had no shape of its own, just a swirling mass of features it had stolen: the trooper's hat, the deer's eyes, the old woman's slack skin. But in the center of the nightmare collage was a mouth, and inside were rows upon rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. It smiled at him. Frank spent the rest of the night huddled on the floor of his cab, listening to the thing circle his truck, testing every door and window, whispering to him in a dozen stolen voices. When the sun finally rose, it was gone. A tow truck found him hours later, incoherent and babbling. He quit his job the next day. He told them the truck broke down. He never told them what really happened on the midnight route, or about the long, deep scratches he found ringing the entirety of his disabled rig, as if something had tried to pry it open, like a can of meat.